Great, okay. All right, good afternoon. Ian Hughes is here. Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to today's Irish Studies Research Seminar, whether this is the first one you've been to or you're regular. You're all very welcome. There's a couple of seats there at the back for my esteemed colleagues if they can squeeze in. So we have an audience online as well as in person. So welcome to everyone who's joining us through Teams. Today's speaker is Dr. Margaret Ward, well known to many people here. Margaret is an honorary senior lecturer in history here at Queen's. She's a feminist historian with particular interest in the contribution of Irish women to particular movements in the 20th century. A graduate of Queen's, she's taught history here at the WEA, at the University of the West of England, and at Bath Spa University. She's also been Assistant Director of Democratic Dialogue, 2005, and Director of the Women's Resource and Development Agency, 2005 to 13. And amongst her many publications are Unmanageable Revolutionaries, Women and Irish Nationalism in 1983, biographies of Maud Gonne and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, and edited works on Irish women and the vote, Becoming Citizens, and Irish women and nationalism, Soldiers, New Women and Wicked Hags, and also an edition of Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, Suffragette and Sinn Féiner, her memoirs and political writings. And most recently, I can see there's a typo in my publicity, but published at the end of last year, 2024, her new book, Rebel Women, Cumann mBan in Belfast and the Glens of Antrim, 1914 to 24, published by Beyond the Pale here in Belfast. And that's what Margaret's going to talk to us about today, Rebel Women. So Margaret, without further ado.
Nice. I was going to sit down, but it's such a crowded room. I think I'll try and stand and look at the slides as well. I don't have the thing to move on, so I'll be asking Luke to do that for me. So I'm really thrilled to be able to be here at Queen's to talk about Rebel Women. When I was a postgraduate student here in the 1970s, I wanted to research women, Irish women, and what they had done in the past, and I was told then that they hadn't done anything. If they had done something, it would have been written about, and it hadn't been written about, which proved they hadn't done anything. And it took me about a year to go around and talk to different professors and different departments to say, look, I really want to do this. I don't want to do any other research. And it's really hard to believe now that that was the attitude. It was a very male-focused view of history that we had, but also it was very difficult to find out what happened in the archives to women. The first slide, please. Because if you look at my first book, Unmanageable Revolutionaries, was first published in 1983, and it took a broad sweep on women and Irish nationalism. It started with the Ladies' Land League of the 1880s, and it went up more or less to the end of the 1970s. And it looks at Republican feminism of that time. And then it was reprinted a couple of times in the 1990s. And then I reissued it, but with an update in 2022. And it had grown a lot. It's 460 pages in the last edition. But it still didn't have Belfast women in particular, or County Antrim women. I was really conscious all the time that there was this big gap, that I was looking at Cumann mBan as an organisation, but pretty Dublin focused, because that was really where most of the testimonies had come from. And also when I had started in the 1970s, the conflict here, as you know, was ongoing, and it wasn't a particularly good time to start asking people if they had active Republicans in their families. So the idea of an oral history just didn't happen. And just before I talk a bit more about how Rebel Women came about, I want to just say a little bit more about the archives and the difficulties of finding out what happened to women, because if you look at the next slide, Callum Crystal wrote about Cumann in the Irish Revolution, and he tried to work out how many there would have been in terms of the different provinces. So in 1921, he looked at their convention that year at the height of Cumann, really, and they had roughly 20,000 members. So he then worked out, looking at their proportion of the population, what they would have had. So Munster, which is so active with Cork and Kerry, you have one branch to under 3,000 of the population. And by the time you come to Ulster, you've got one branch of Cumann to nearly 35,000 of the population. Irish nationalists were so much in the minority in Ulster generally, and obviously in Belfast as 25% of the population. And not everyone would have been an active Republican or a supporter of Sinn Féin. A lot of them would have supported the Irish Parliamentary Party. So it was difficult to find out who was active, because there wasn't the kind of resources to go about. And you had to be, as one historian said, brave to be a Republican at that time, to put your head up and to have become visible. And so we still didn't know very much about it. And there's the next slide is Sean O'Neill was one of the IRA brigadiers in Belfast in the 1920s, but he had been a member of the British Army, and he had trained the Irish volunteers before 1916. There are accounts from Nora Connolly and Ina Connolly, daughters of James Connolly, saying that Sean O'Neill, they escorted him out to the hills in Belfast in secret so that he could train the volunteers, and he was also training Cumann as well. And he seems to have been somebody always very supportive of women. You'll come across his name again because he writes references for some of the women. He took the pro-treaty side and joined the Free State Army, but still seems to have maintained a relationship with Cumann activists, whether or not they took the treaty side. Well, he wrote to Dennis McCulloch, and Dennis McCulloch was one of the leading figures in Belfast in the IRB. His wife Una Ryan was the founder member of Cumann in 1914 in Belfast. She was a teacher in St Mary's Training College, and she and a few of her colleagues were members of Cumann. The McCullochs moved down to Dublin at the time of the treaty. But Sean O'Neill writes to Dennis McCulloch in 1937 asking, sorry, just to stay back at the other slide, he's trying to find out numbers of women in Belfast Cumann, and you can see he's writing down different names, and then he's typing a list, and it's very partial, to put it mildly. So that was one of the first attempts. And then when you look at, if you're interested in looking at the military service pensions, and you go on to and click on to Antrim to find out names there, what you'll get for Belfast, the next slide please, is just this. In an interview with the advisory committee, Mrs McCulloch and Valentine promised to have a Cumann Brigade Committee established in Belfast to send in the required organisation records. So that was in 1937. So Mrs McCulloch, that is Una, Dennis McCulloch's wife, and the other is Emily Valentine, who was a Cumann member from Dublin, but she operated in Belfast for quite a while until the house that she and her family were living in was burnt out, and they then moved back to Dublin. So there is no Belfast list of names, and for the whole of County Antrim, they only list the branches in Lochgiel, Dunloy and Clough-Mills, and there's only 21 names, and most of those are verified by Justin McCampbell, and he was a head of the 2nd Brigade in North Antrim, and it's mainly his sisters that he's listed and some of their friends. That's who he remembers, and there aren't any others. So Ballycastle, for example, is a really active branch, as you'll find out, and Glenraffel, and they're not listed at all in terms of membership. And so then if you go on again to the military service pension collections and click on to County Antrim, you'll get 78 names. And not all of those are either complete applications, and not all of them really relate to Belfast. There might have been people who put down Belfast as an address for a period of time. So eventually, having weeded all of this out, I came up with 39 names for Belfast and 13 for the Glens of Antrim, the two areas in County Antrim that women operated. And one of those 39 from Belfast is not in the pensions. There were a number of women who just didn't apply for pensions, either because they weren't in need of the money, or because, more likely, because they were anti-treaty and didn't want anything to do with what they regarded as a Free State organisation. So, for example, Annie Ward, who's the officer in command of central Belfast after Winnie Carney resigns, she's not in it. And yet, you know, her name appears. And I know she lived in King Street, and either her father or her brother were cork manufacturers, and she has sisters who are also active. And she gets mentioned, but I don't know any more than that. So very frustrating. But another thing to say before we get on to actually who the women are and what they did is, when we think about the history before we started putting women into it, before we had a much more gendered account, we didn't always think, when we read some of the male accounts, I'm thinking of something like Dan Breen, My Fight for Irish Freedom, or some of the other accounts, there wasn't really an assumption that women were always there, because when you read men's accounts, you don't see them. Quite often they're invisible. So when the pension collection first came out, the first tranche, the next slide please, Sulahead Beg was a really important event. It was really the start of the War of Independence. This was an ambush in Tipperary of a quantity of gelignite, and some of the RIC were killed in this fight with the IRA. But it took place on the same day as Dáil Éireann first met. But it was regarded, basically, it wasn't sanctioned by Dáil Éireann, but this is when the guerrilla warfare started. But it's only when the pension files came out that we realised not only were there 8 men involved, but there were 5 women. And of course there had to be women. How would they have done what they did without women? And so the women who applied for and got pensions said what they did. Lena Crowe scouted when the gelignite was coming. She scouted on the day of ambush. She said she was really close to them, looking at what was happening. Lena Shanahan catered for them before. Mary Clare catered for them. Marion Tabine, who wasn't in Cumann but was in the IRA, she said, took in Breen, Tracy and Hogan after. Dan Breen says only that Mrs. Tabine fed us beforehand. You know, she was a great woman. So I mean, that's all you get from him. But you also get the consequences for women. May Clare said her house was raided 60 times in a month and it was finally burnt down. She had to go on the run. Lena Shanahan talked about her home being raided immediately afterwards, but also a gun being put into her mouth by one of the men coming into the house. And the house was then burnt and blown up by the military finally in 21. And she said that she lived in an outhouse afterwards, saving arms, ammunition and paper. And a lot of those women then had terrible health problems afterwards. So keep that in mind, you know, that it's only when the pension collection started that we really started to understand that it was a much bigger operation, that it involved the population in a way that people maybe haven't thought of before. So when we look at Belfast now, the Bureau of Military History was set up by the Free State to take evidence from participants in the War of Independence, and the idea was that nothing would be released until everyone was dead, a bit like the Boston tapes, but you know, less controversial. But I remember interviewing Cumann activists like Ethna Coyle, who had been president of Cumann, and she gave me her statement for the Bureau. But as she said, you know, we'll all be dead before they're released, and they weren't released until 2003. But there weren't that many women in it, and it was very Dublin centred, and there were 4 women from Belfast, but they were only interviewed about what they did in 1916, so we got nothing about the later period. So I looked at some of all of the men who were operating in the north to see what they might have said about women. So Roger Macaulay is one of the most notorious of the gunmen, head of the active service unit in Belfast. And then he has 54 pages in the Bureau of Military History, and there is no mention of women at all. And I just wanted to give one example. Crossguard Barracks was attacked in July 1920, and he does this very gung-ho thing. We succeeded in wounding about half the garrison, although we didn't manage to actually take the garrison. But we were back home before the British reinforcements had left Belfast. And there's nothing there about how they had armament, what they did, were they walking down the road with all their gear afterwards. You just do not know from Macaulay's account until you read Mary Russell, who was a textile worker, very active in Cumann. She said that when they were going to Ballynahinch and Crossguard Barracks, I assisted them in every way I could. I got them ready, met them on the road going there, was waiting in a quiet place on Fountain Street. At that time, most of the stuff all came to me, and I got the best part of it removed the next day. Maggie Fitzpatrick worked for Danny McDevitt, who's a very interesting character, a socialist Republican who had a tailor shop in Rosemary Street, and the IRA had a big arms dump in North Street, and you could only access it through Danny McDevitt. And she said that her role was constantly engaged in shifting arms for C Company and supporting the active service unit. She said she took her orders directly from Macaulay and Joe Murray, and that she and Mary Russell picked up arms after another well-known event when they attacked the Spence and Johnson motor car firm, which had military vehicles. And she said they were briefed by Macaulay and Murray. So you get a very different picture when you start to put all of these together. So with all of that kind of background, I want to then go on now to, first of all, to Belfast and the women there. In the central branch, I've just picked that out. So 19 women I've identified, 8 were employed in the textile industry, with another one, Winifred Carney, working for the textile union, and then the Transport and General Workers Union. There were 3 office workers, 2 teachers, 2 shop workers, and 3, I don't know, one of them I know wasn't working. She was the youngest of the family and seems to have devoted her time to supporting the IRA. And then in North Antrim, the 14 women there, 7 worked in the family farm, 1 worked in a family pub. There was 1 textile worker who I'll talk about, Breach McCampbell, who works a textile worker in Belfast, but then comes home to Dunloy. 2 office workers, 2 were married with children, and 1 I don't know about. So it was in Belfast, it was a very working class membership generally, and women, you know, were combining their working life with their support for the IRA. And the IRA in Belfast and in North Antrim were extremely short of weaponry. So one of the really important things was about hiding the guns, bringing them out for operations, collecting them afterwards. Nothing could ever, you know, it was a real tragedy if things fell into enemy hands. The women had things in wardrobes and floorboards all over the place. I want to start just by very briefly talking about the Corrs, because I'm sure you're all familiar with the mural of the Corr family down the Ormo Road, which was done during the decade of centenaries, partly because Nell and Elizabeth Corr were Cumann members. Their brother Henry was an Irish volunteer. He's the one who actually encouraged them to join Cumann. And then they had 2 other brothers who emigrated, one to Australia and one to Canada, and they both joined up on the Allied side during the First World War, and George was killed at the Somme. They didn't fight in British Army uniform, but they fought in Canada and Australia. But what's interesting, there are photos as well of Elizabeth in Cumann uniform, and that's the only person I can see from the north, whoever wore a uniform. I don't know whether the women ever possessed them, whether it was too dangerous to have been in uniform. I mean, I don't know when they would have had an opportunity to have marched in uniform in the north. And when Elizabeth did have her uniform, it was prior to 1916, a very different kind of era than the post, I mean, 1920 onwards. So they both joined Cumann in 1914 and were involved with Nora and Dinah Connolly and two other friends, Kathleen Murphy and Ailish Allen, in being sent to Tyrone prior to the rising, just the day before, in order to service the County Tyrone volunteers. And the idea was that they would eventually meet up with Liam Mellows in Galway. They discovered when they were in Tyrone that there were countermanding orders stopping the rising. So they all decided, the 6 women, that they would go down to Dublin to warn the leadership. So they famously got the midnight train from Dungannon to Dublin, got there at dawn and went over and warned the leadership. And then they were sent north again with new orders. They tried to find the volunteers who had not now all scattered in the hills, couldn't find them. Elizabeth had been a typist in Belfast Central Library, was absent without leave, back late to work, and was dismissed because she wouldn't give an account of why she hadn't come back to work on time. And so she didn't actually she worked for the family firm, which was a property rental business, but after that didn't work other than in the core family. But she then was active in the Longford by-election. They did things like prison visiting, a very nice letter from Terence McSweeney thanking them for the support that they gave to his wife Muriel when she was up in Crumlin Road visiting him. And then later on, the IRA, during the War of Independence period, asked them to form a North Queen Street branch of Cumann to service the IRA in that area. Now, what's interesting about them is that they all 6 of the women apply for military service pensions for their work in the Easter Rising, and are annoyed because the Connolly sisters get the pension before Elizabeth's arguing that, you know, Nora Connolly did nothing that she hadn't done as well, and why hadn't she got a pension? The women all went down to Dublin to give evidence to the pension referees, apart from Nell. Nell didn't go down, and for that reason, I think she didn't get a pension. But she writes to the pension people saying, my work of organising and drilling made possible the more spectacular exploits of individual members, and was very annoyed and upset that she didn't get a pension. Elizabeth received a military pension for Easter week, but all the other work, the by-election, the prison visiting, etc., was dismissed as routine by the pension assessors. They both got service medals, and that's the other thing that's really important. The work that women did had to be not simply delivering a message, it had to be delivering a message in a situation that was extremely dangerous to somebody who was important. If you had arms, you had to have substantial amounts of arms. They had to be in your personal possession. You had to be the one accounting for them. So they had to prove that they were working as military support, and everything else was always being dismissed as routine. So anything like visiting prisoners or making first aid kits or fundraising would not count in getting a pension. The next woman I want to talk about is Cassie O'Hara. She's the only one who that I have that didn't apply for a pension. And the reason that I know about her is she's the grand aunt of the comedian Tim McGarry, who had talked to me about Cassie. Now, at the time, even as I was going to press, I was still saying to Tim, have the family not got any photos of Cassie? And that's been one of the things that's been so great about researching the book and contacting relatives, that it spurred people on to try and accumulate family information. So we finally did get photos of Cassie. The top one on the right is when she was getting her diploma as a teacher, as a very young woman, and then a later photo. And then the book on the George Birmingham book, The Red Hand of Ulster, Cassie's writing there about how did they, you know, I can't read it from here now. Yes, how did they pass the Union by treachery and fraud, like men who sold their lands in gold? You know, Judas, you know, sold his God, right? Thank you. Which is very nice. The family have obviously kept that as one of their memories of Cassie. But she was the daughter of a pork butcher in Smithfield, then trained as a teacher and taught for quite a while, and joined Cumann Central Branch. And she would have been influenced by those initial women who were the teachers in St Mary's who had set up Cumann. She was very strongly anti-treaty. She was the fiancée of Joe McKelvey, who was the leader of the anti-treaty forces in the north. And he was one of them executed on the 8th of December 1922, along with Liam Mellows, Dick Barrett and McKelvey, as from the 4 provinces. So Joe McKelvey was executed representing Ulster, and she was presented with his uniform afterwards. So she then refused to take the oath of allegiance when the Northern Ireland state was formed. The Unionist government insisted that anyone in the public sector, employees, teachers particularly, had to take an oath of allegiance, which meant that many Republicans lost their jobs. Then they wouldn't take it. She and her sister set up a small shop selling baby clothes in Castle Street, which I think that I vaguely remember in the mid-1960s. And then she continued to be an active Republican. Jimmy Steele, one of the IRA leaders in the North, said that he preferred to talk to Cassie O'Hara than many of his men. She was a very staunch Republican. She was interned by the Northern authorities and was OC of Cumann when interned. Wasn't released until July 45. There were, you know, a lot of Republicans interned during the Second World War, seen as kind of traitors to Britain. But this is one of the few accounts that we can see Cassie in somebody else's pension application, and this is from Una McCrudden, who lived on the Upper Newton Arts Road and was very active. She talked about at the end of April 1922, and at that particular period, this is just at the start of what was called the Northern Resistance, spearheaded by Michael Collins, which was intended to unite the pro and anti-treaty factions together as a joint attack on the northern authorities, which failed abysmally and was immediately followed by what they called the Big Roundup, a massive internment. But about the end of April 1922, a parcel was left in our house, and we, Bridie O'Farrell and I, brought it the following night to the house of Cassie O'Hara. Letters and packets still came and were forwarded to Hugh Corfin or Joe Cullen. Often they were brought to Cassie O'Hara's house for that purpose. We usually met there or in the house of Annie Ward. So you can see how very kind of intricate and closely knit all of this was. Annie Ward is in King Street, Cassie O'Hara is in Smithfield. They're all very, very closely linked together. Next slide. Bridie O'Farrell was just mentioned there, and she's a very interesting woman. And I think one of the things to remember is that prior to partition, you know, people moved around Ireland quite freely and might live in the north for a while or move south. And Bridie O'Farrell, born in County Kildare in the late 1960s, started off her political life as a member of Nini Naheran and the Friends of Maud Gonne in Dublin. But then she joined the Ulster Theatre Players, and quite a few of the Irish literary theatre people came north for a while and acted in the north. And the Ulster Theatre Players what they wanted to do was to do something similar to what was happening in the south, which eventually became the Abbey Theatre. But the Ulster Theatre Players, they they weren't professional, they were amateur, but of a very high standard. They played in the Opera House, and this one here, The Drone, was actually taken on Broadway. It was also, they also played in the Royalty Theatre in London and a lot of other places. And the woman with the shawl is Bridie O'Farrell. So she was kind of specialised in kind of spinster sisters and shrewish women and things, because she was slightly older, I think, than the rest of them. But she also was, she joined the Dungannon Club in 1907. Quite a few of the women who later joined Cumann do. They're friends of Sean McDermott, for example, when he's a Dungannon Club organiser in the north. So there's a lot of interlinking. And she's a very early member of Cumann. She was one of the ones chosen to go to Tyrone as well. Ina Connolly says that she was an older woman, would have been a steadying hand, but with the demobilisation orders, only that first batch of women went, so Bridie would have gone. But she was also anti-treaty, as you could gather from that last clip with Cassie O'Hara. She, as far as I can gather, looking at the census, I think had been a baker or something like that, or worked in a grocery shop, certainly later on, lived in North Belfast. And in 1935, she's really ill and applies for a pension. She doesn't write the pension. Her friend, Saoirse Sherrod, writes it for her. Saoirse is a next-door neighbour of Annie Ward. Hugh Corvin, who had been in the IRA, has set up his own accountancy firm by this stage, and he also supplies a reference. He said that he's her financial guarantor, he says in this application, and he knows she's in very dire need of financial aid because he's been told that she's £4 in arrears on her rent, and he's guaranteeing that. But she dies not long after. And it's not until 1942 that you see some attached to her file. She was refused a pension, which is, I call in the book, a posthumous insult. But I think partly it was because she didn't write her own application, so she couldn't give the kind of detail that the pension assessors would have wanted. But Una McCrudden said that she was the best worker and given the longest service of anyone we had. People talk about her fundraising down at Castle Junction. She was a very familiar figure down there in early years. And one of the reasons we have that amount of information about her is that she comes up on a newspaper search, unlike so many other women. There was a large funeral procession. The shops all closed en route on the Falls Road, and the newspaper said testimony to the esteem in which Miss O'Farrell was held, and there were 13 RUC surrounding the graveside. They were in the hopes that there would be an oration that they could then arrest that person, but there wasn't an oration given, presumably because nobody wanted to be arrested for doing this. Nora O'Boyle is an interesting woman. She was a handkerchief stitcher from the Falls, living with her widowed mother, and again was an early joiner of the Gaelic League and the Dungannon Club. And a lot of the census information, you see that a lot of women learn Irish, and particularly the younger members of the family. The older siblings might not have learned Irish, but the younger ones do. So you can see that Irish is starting to become something important in the north at the time. She joins seconded to the IRA as a courier, and this happens to quite a few women. It's interesting that there were, women had a large role to play within the IRA, and one of the activities that about 5 of the Belfast women were involved in was sending arms to the active service units that was set up in Cavan. This was made up of Belfast men who were on the run, who couldn't operate freely in Belfast or the surrounds, so it's decided to set up an active service unit in Cavan, but it was also decided it had to be armed by arms from Belfast. And as I said, there weren't that many, and it was Belfast women who transported them to Cavan. And this is an affidavit signed by Sean O'Neill and Roger Macaulay, a very rare one from Roger Macaulay, he didn't sign too many. While in possession of rifles concealed in a golf bag, Mr. Boyle was trapped in a cordon of British troops, but with great coolness succeeded in bluffing the troops and got the arms safely through. And then there's an ambush in Cavan, and one of the men is killed. And so she's sent back to Cavan to identify the body, make arrangements for the funeral, to contact the men on the run. So she has an important role, a role that other men couldn't have done at the time without consequences for them. And in the post-truce period, she's anti-treaty. She supplies the IRA with arms before operations and dumps after. And then during the Civil War, she goes down to Dundalk with arms, and she sends dispatches up to Derry. Though she says that when she gets to Derry, they're all scattered and there's nobody she can actually give the dispatch to. So she continues to operate and is finally arrested in April 23, imprisoned in Cumann and the North Dublin Union. She later marries and has one son, and very contented wife and mother, but still has friends from old comrades who come and visit the house. Rose Black is the only woman I know of that has such an amount of men who've actually written a whole affidavit on her behalf, who are really senior IRA figures. She lived off the Falls Road with her sisters Lizzie and Maggie. They were all textile workers, and Rose was really I don't know why she hadn't joined Cumann earlier than this. So she doesn't join until 1919, and she's age 41 then. So she has very little eyesight in one eye, and not great eyesight in the other. But the IRA see this house as being very important, and she gets seconded to the IRA, is told, don't be visiting prisoners or anything like that. That makes you known to the authorities, because she's a custodian then for the brigade finances. She's a high-level courier between Belfast and Dublin with golden explosives, and it's at the level with Michael Collins. That's the kind of person that she's a courier for. And then when the Lord Mayor of Cork is killed, the Cork IRA come up to Lisburn on a mission to assassinate RIC Oswald Swansea, who was one of the men who had killed Thomas McCurtain. So when they come up to do a reconnaissance in Lisburn, she guides and houses them, and when they come up to do the deed, again she houses them. She's arrested in July 1921 and held in Armagh, and then and held until much later than the other prisoners. And then again, she remains active, and she's interned in February 1923, finally released on health grounds in the August, and goes blind shortly after. She's sent down to Dublin for eye treatment, and there's lots and lots of medical reports. She gets a special wound pension of £100 a year because she has lost her eyesight, and it's felt that the eyesight deteriorated because of prison conditions and the white cells. And you can see, that the house belonging to the subject and her two sisters was for all practical purposes a brigade and company headquarters. But you've got that affidavit there signed by all of those IRA figures, really senior figures, so that she gets her pension. One of her other sisters gets a service medal. They all apply for the pension forms, but Rose is the only one who returns it. But one of the other sisters gets a service medal, and all of the later correspondence with Rose is really sad because it's just an X, and it's her sisters who are doing all the correspondence for her. Nora McCarthy is a very interesting figure. She joined Central Branch in 1915. Her brothers are active, but Nora herself, she's quite young. She's one who doesn't seem to have taken a job. She spends her time working for the movement. She becomes section commander in West Belfast, and as Shauna Neal says, her home was open to the movement. The family was very involved. So she visits prisoners, but not only that, she makes friends with the warders. She knows the wife of one of the deputy governor as well, and she uses all of those contacts as much as so she smuggles guns into Crumlin Road. Her brother Dan is in Crumlin Road, and while she's there, she gets to know the Kerry prisoners. There's a large group of them there. Austin Stack is the OC of Crumlin Road at the time, but she meets this man, Dan McCarthy, who she later marries. But she also stores weapons for Thomas McNulty, his quartermaster for C Company, and she says in her affidavit that McNulty would put a long coat on me and strap the rifle on. I mean, she was only 5 foot. You can imagine her. What I find extraordinary is that in the summer of 1921, she uses a hand cart to transport arms hidden under bed covers from McNulty's house in the New Lodge, which, as he calls hostile territory, to her house in Dover Street at the Falls. And McNulty says that she transferred 11 rifles, 6 revolvers, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. So it's not just Nora writing this in the pension application. She has to have this verified by an IRA officer. And then she marries Dan McCarthy, who's from Kerry, as I say. And during the Civil War, she testifies that she carried guns to Castle Islands, Kerry, because Dan's operating there during the Civil War. And her great nephew, who I've got to know, who's been very helpful in terms of supplying photographs, said to me today that he discovered that she was 7 months pregnant at the time, where she talks about this really grueling journey, several miles of which was on some kind of cart. But on the other hand, we think being 7 months pregnant might have made it easier to smuggle guns. So who knows? I just heard that today, so that's particularly interesting. So 2 of the photos, one of them, I mean, that's a very interesting one. On the top, you see the very small figure of Nora surrounded by these men, and it looks like it's a Kerry, but De Valera is inspecting them, and they're there all with their service medals. And she and Dan, although he was from Kerry, he moved up to Belfast and lived with her. They lived in Belfast for the rest of their lives and brought up their family here. He was very tall. He was over 6 foot and was often the flag bearer for Republican demonstrations in Belfast. But you can see her then in Milltown at the grave during one of the Easter ceremonies, which were difficult. I mean, most of them were banned in Belfast at this time under the Special Powers Act. But Nora, so they remained very active. There are a lot of photos of her in different periods. And you can see that they remained active, because one of the things I'm interested in is not only what women did at the time, but what their afterlives were. How did they adjust to partition and living in a state that was so hostile to them? Next one. This woman, Mary Molly Kerr, her mother was widowed and they lived in North Belfast, but Molly lived on her own. And
yes,
but not
I did know that I was.
she joined Cumann and was then very soon attached to the IRA as a dispatch carrier. And in 1920, she was given the title of court missionary, which I wondered what it was and looked it up, and maybe some people here in the audience know more about it, but apparently it was like a precursor
The IRA.
worker that you were related. It was attached to St. Joseph's, but it was to people who were in prison. So the prisoners who she was able to have free access to prison because of her.
Well, they were.
Missionary. They were interested in communicating with particular prisoners. Molly was able to organise open visits to the prisoners. She also knew, again, particularly one Warder Leonard, who was a Republican. She knew him well and was able to communicate and smuggle messages to the prisoners. Charlotte Despard came up to the north. she and Maud Gonne were doing a tour of Ireland in 1921, seeing what had happened to houses burnt down, mainly in the Cork and Kerry area. But Charlotte came up to Belfast to inspect the homes that had been burnt during the pogrom on behalf of the White Cross. So she's interned in Armagh, released. She's only released because she agrees to be excluded from Northern Ireland. And this was the other real worry that people had, that if they were caught, they would be served with exclusion orders. So she was served with an exclusion order. She had to promise not to come back to the north for at least 2 years. And obviously the hope was that if people left for 2 years, they would then settle wherever and they wouldn't come back to the north. So she goes down to Dublin, where she has a brother, and she runs a boarding house in Dublin until she's not well enough to do it anymore. That's her income after that, and she talks about that when she applies for her pension. So there were 2 women who were active. I mean, it's not the sort of thing that you think that women with children could have been that active. I'm talking about 2 women now, one of whom is in Belfast. Elizabeth Delaney is the OC of the West Belfast branch, and her first child was born in 1910. So by the time the conflict is really on, she is a mother with several children. She's the only woman member, she said, of the propaganda committee of Belfast Sinn Féin, and I don't know any more about that. I haven't been able to find out about that. But she did the normal kinds of Cumann work of visiting prisoners. Her family were from Tyrone, so she carried dispatches to Cookstown and Dublin, and she was basically, her branch supported the engineering battalion of the 3rd Northern, so she hid a lot of rifles, explosives and grenades at home, and was responsible then for bringing them out when necessary. And she's often seen in the pension applications. She writes very strong letters of recommendation to her former colleagues, and she seems to have been a very sort of steady influence there. You just feel that she is. But in May 1920, one of her children, Maureen, dies aged 2 months, and she says at that stage in her application that she wasn't active for a short while. She doesn't say why, but she doesn't take that much time off. She stops in 1922, not because she supports the treaty, she is anti-treaty, but I think by that stage her family took over. But she was described as not a stay-at-home mother. She didn't get she married Fred, who was a postal worker, and they always felt that he didn't get the kinds of promotion that he should have done because of his wife's activities. She didn't work in terms of paid work, but went on to do commercial training, typing, etc., and wrote a lot, not about her experiences, but kind of little stories and things. It's very frustrating. She didn't write anything about the experience of being in Cumann. And when she died, she didn't have a Republican funeral because the family decided that it would have a detrimental consequences to her family. One of her sons was setting up as a solicitor at the time, and they felt that it wouldn't do his work any good. So there are all these kinds of implications and repercussions for the descendants of these activists. The other woman who is going to be known to half the audience here because who are composed of Scallies. Mary Scally is married in 1911, so by 1920 she has 2 children, and she's a member of Ballycastle, Cumann, and a lot of the women that I found from the Glens and that area seem to have come from Ballycastle. But this last summer, my husband and I went round to Torhead Coast Guard Station just to see it, so that the building in the foreground are the living quarters of not only the Coast Guard workers but their families, and the top part is the ruins of the actual Coast Guard Station. So it was attacked twice, and the first time is September 1920 when it's raided by 50 armed men, seizing 5 revolvers, 280 rounds of ammunition. I mean, they basically cleaned the place out: rockets, telescopes, binoculars, the heliograph, and the telephone. But then James McCoggin, who worked with her, writes this testimonial for Mary's pension application, that she carried arms for the attack on Tor Coast Guard Station in a pram underneath a child, in order that we'd get them for the attack on the Coast Guard Station. And she took part in raids on the post office at the Quay, Ballycastle, helping in disposing of the articles taken in the raid. And she played an important part in saving my life at the Ballycastle Barracks raid in May 22, at which I got very badly wounded. She was out that night, and when I was shot through the body, she assisted me to her own house, and during intense firing, went through it all and brought the doctor to stop the bleeding, and at great personal risk. And he says she's responsible, yes, for saving my life. So, you know, a dedicated, extraordinary woman who works. He doesn't fill in a lot of detail. You get more detail from James McCoggin. I think maybe it's a modest woman in terms of, doesn't say a lot about her role, but it's the terrain, thinking about it and thinking about Mary Scally and a lot of the other women who would have been operating in similar terrain, really difficult conditions, you know, whether you were walking, driving, or on a bike, all of them, you know, difficult. I think driving a car around there is still pretty bumpy and difficult and narrow and all the rest of it. Another woman who was very interesting is Katie McElheron, who was Katie Murray. Again, an early member of Sinn Féin. She was branch captain of Cushendall, Cumann, and I hadn't realised, I always assumed Sean Murray, who was a leading communist Republican activist, I always thought he was a Dubliner, but he was her brother Sean, and he joined the IRA at the same time as she joined Cumann. They were both Irish speakers and had joined Sinn Féin. And Katie is one of the few that really does a very detailed pension application and seems to have had brilliant recall of what she did. So she has an intelligence role and scouted in advance of IRA operations, as many other women would have done. It wouldn't have been the men who were doing all that scouting. I don't think it would have been women. So she said before one particular IRA operation, she arranged housing in case of casualties, made an arrangement with the owner of a motor car in case of need, took 2 rifles, 30 rounds of ammunition, and a Mills bomb from a dump, and brought them by car to B Company. And when Carnlough Coast Guard Station was attacked, she delivered arms to a point on the Carnlough Road, and Cumann members were on duty along the road to collect arms and attend to the wounded. And then she procured and delivered petrol for an attack on Parkmore railway station. And then after May 1922, when you have the defeat of the IRA, and particularly in the Glens of Antrim, where you have men hiding out in dumps, and they're completely reliant on women who are doing the intelligence work, finding out where the B specials are, whether they're coming close, bringing dry clothes and food to the men. She helped to dump the arms and hide them. She supported the men on the run, and then she said she hired cars and escorted men leaving the area. And I don't think the men would have really been able to leave the area without support of women like her. Another woman, Katie McCart, said that they were stopped on one occasion, and she had to think very quickly. She said they were a wedding party getting together and were able to get through. And there's one other woman from the Glens that I'd also like to talk about, because the McCampbells of Dunloy were some family. I mean, they were a large family, but were also a very active family. Lena, Bridge, Ginny and Casilda all joined Cumann, and their brother Hugh was an IRA captain. And they were very active in terms of cultural activities and the Gaelic League. They set up the Camogie Club in the area and all sorts of other activities. So the top photo of Lena is her in kind of full Gaelic costume that was made by one of her sisters. She went to Belfast and lived with her sisters. They lived off the Lower Ormo Road and were burnt out, were intimidated out of there. And she talks about it in a tape recording, how terrifying it was. It was after curfew. They managed to get themselves up to the Falls Road, where they stayed with other relatives. But she had been a member. She was a member of Belfast Cumann throughout this time with her sisters. But she then moves back to Dunloy and becomes captain of the Dunloy branch, and is a dispatch carrier for the area. Now, she really doesn't talk very much about her activities. It's more her captain, Mary alone, that gives the testimony for what Lena had done. That she would deliver dispatches to the brigade headquarters, which is 22 miles away, and do that twice a week, and bring arms and ammunition through security cordons. She hid and delivered weapons, made first aid kits, and again escorted men across the border. Brian Cunning, who was the IRA captain in Lochgiel, she marries, doesn't marry in Ireland, they actually marry in Cuba. Brian leaves, emigrates from the north. He's anti-treaty, and Lena apparently doesn't have papers to get to America at the time, so they marry in Cuba, and then they settle in Florida after that, and live the rest of their time in Florida and bring up their family there. But she returns to Ireland once before, and then they both come back in 1971, and they're presented with service medals at the Curragh. And that's that photo that you can see of Lena and Brian with their service medals on. But there's a lot of interest in their return, because 1971 here is internment and all hell, broken loose, so that they come back and they see this. And, for Brian, who hasn't been here for 50 years, they're talking about their experiences and seeing it happen again. It's a really interesting interview. And finally, just an account from Anna McNulty, who's president of Cumann in County Tyrone. She'd gone down to Dublin for her interview with the pension assessors, and is on the train. She said, for the grand old north, she says with huge sarcasm, I think. And she says about her experience, I think the people of the Free State and some of those in Dublin forget we've not gained our freedom yet. We're still suspects. I'd consider my life well spent if I could discover some clan or persons who could make public the fight we had in this district around Dromore. Unfortunately, we Northerners cannot brag. We're still patiently waiting for De Valera to do something for us. Well, when Fianna Fáil came to power as the anti-treaty party, I mean, they did do something. They extended the military service pension legislation to include those who fought against the treaty and fought in the Civil War, and included then women who hadn't been part of the initial legislation. And it's through that, I suppose, that makes public what people had done. So, a grateful Marie Coleman has said, that the pension, the information in the pension collection makes it really the best documented war of national independence that we can have, and extracting from that what women have done really opens up information that I just, when I was starting in the 1970s, never thought would be possible to find. And I'm so grateful to the amount of relatives who have contacted me and augmented the information that was very bare to give a much more rounded picture of what happened to people and also how they survived in the later period. So thank you.
Margaret, you're happy to take a few questions.
Yes.
So people in the room, just if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. People online, if you kind of raise your hand digitally, Luke will alert us to that. So let's start here in a minute.
Margaret, thank you very much. Thank you for the work you've done. It's fantastic and very important. And you emphasised the role of records. And I'm intrigued by the medals and the award of medals and the decision making around that and the subset of the decision making of who got the crock, the bar on their medal to indicate that they'd be holding active service. Are there any records of that? Because those decisions must have been very important decisions and must have been evidenced, and particularly that one about whether they got a crock medal, a bar on their medal or not. Are there any archives of that?
Well, there's a list when you go into the military, so there's a list of the medals, but they don't give. In fact, the black sister who gets the service medal is a little bit more information about hers, but most of them it just gives just that. But it says then that you can go into, I think you have to be a family member to go into the archives. Maybe, I don't know if...
No, I think the medal files are so extensive, they haven't been digitised. You can check the name. In terms of the bar, that's for anyone who has a military service pension.
That's what I was going to say, yeah.
The bar is for recognition. It's sort of it was the way to placate the ones who didn't get a pension. But if you can find the name, as Margaret was saying there, if you can find the name on...
Sorry, I missed that. Who got what on?
Anyone who qualified for military service pension was entitled to the medal with bar.
Yes.
Others were given the medal without bar if they didn't have a pension. Say the lady who died and wasn't awarded the pension in 42, had she still been alive, they'd probably have given her the medal without bar, so it was a kind of consolation prize.
Oh, right.
But if you can find the name online in the database, you can go down. You don't have to be a family member.
You don't.
Right. You can go down to the military archives.
And is there a plan to digitise those records?
No, I think they're just too expensive.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Because a lot of those stories will be undoubtedly recounted in those medal applications.
Possibly, yeah.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And just quite a specific question, but we've talked about Cassie before, Cassie O'Hara, and as far as I remember, her family she wasn't from a family that was very active. And so I was really interested by what you said about her learning, her discussing things with older teachers who'd been involved in the previous generation. Do you get a sense that there was that in St Mary's? Was it just that case? Is there any record of that passing on, in the profession of that?
She would have had, because of when she would have been there, she would have still been there at the same time as Roisin Walsh, because Roisin Walsh doesn't leave isn't intimidated out of Belfast till 1919. So I'm making the assumption that she would have been taught by her, that there must have been some links to, but she's the only one. I haven't seen anyone else who was at St Mary's who, was also in Cumann. I don't think there was necessarily a broader, or bigger cohort.
Yeah, because I just wondered where if it passed on to she becomes the teacher, but maybe not.
Well, I do think that her experience in St Mary's must have made a difference, because yes, you're right. The rest of the family aren't interested, and she joins the middle classes really by becoming a teacher, and she's got a brother who becomes a solicitor. But on the other hand, he works for Bridie O'Farrell. So I think that he must have some sympathy for the people that Cassie was working with.
Yeah, thank you.
Look, online question.
Yeah, I have a question from Brian Griffin. Do you want to unmute and talk?
I don't. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Hi, Margaret. Fantastic paper. Thank you very much. I wondered, could you say a little? Do your sources give much indication of the women activists' use of the bicycle when they acted as couriers or when transporting weapons or gathering intelligence, etc.?
Yeah, women themselves don't tend to say how they moved around, but you get that more from some of the men. You know, will say, "I met a Cumann woman riding a bicycle, and she said that my house had just been raided, and I was in a car, and she took my car, and I took her bike, and I went." You know, so. Women were more likely, I mean, very few had access to cars. They possibly could drive, but they weren't car owners. They would have been like Katie Murray, who said that she made arrangements to have a car. But women mainly cycled. I mean, a lot of them do talk about cycling, what the distance was that they cycled. It was the main means of transport. One woman worked in Ballymena and would get the train every day, and she worked in intelligence because she was able to use her train journey to look for troop movements and when she got to Ballymena to hear about things that were happening. So she talked much more about a train. She's one of the few who actually talk about using the train. The bicycle does seem to have been the main source of transport, and particularly because they were going to areas that were where people were hiding.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. More questions? Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. Just going back to what a comment you made at the beginning of the talk about the invisibility of women generally, particularly in the early historiography. I just wondered if you'd noticed that just it's the sort of thing I'm looking at the moment, and I don't know whether it's just the things that I've picked out, but do you think there's been a tendency even where women are talked about in the early historiography, there's been a reluctance to mention Cumann as an organisation? Just seems to be a feature that seems to be there, that while they would perhaps mention women individually, I don't know if there was reluctance at times to recognise that there was a women's organisation that were, you know, an independent organisation, highly organised, highly trained. Or, you know, is that something that you've come across at all?
That's interesting. Yeah, they do tend to mention individual women by name. So you don't, you know, so they are kind of almost errant individuals. They're isolated. You don't see, yes, that they're connected in some way. I mean, Ernie O'Malley will say, oh, the women were very bitter. You know, women would say, one of his famous things, you know, women would say, I wish I could fight. I wish I could. They don't know what it's like. But he doesn't, that's as much as you might get as a collective thing about women. But he doesn't talk about, he doesn't say, Cumann.
Yes.
Yeah.
Terms like the women or groups of women or a group of auxiliaries, but the term Cumann seems to be absent all the time.
Although then when you read about women that say, to take Ernie O'Malley as one example that he worked with, two very interesting women that I haven't mentioned, the Brady sisters, who are from Belfast, but most of their work is in Dublin. And they work with Ernie O'Malley. In fact, when he's in jail, he writes to one of them asking for a whole load of books to be sent in to him. And, you know, he wrote to a lot of people asking, you know, everything from Shakespeare, Dickens to whatever to be sent into him. So he worked on a very high level with women. And he does them a huge injustice the way he talks about them then in this autobiography.
Thank you.
Okay. Look, any more questions online? No. Not at all. Can I ask you, Margaret? I mean, you're one example of one Republican family emigrating to the States in the immediate aftermath. Is this an outlier, or is there a dispersal of Cumann women from the north, given the kind of defeat of the revolution in the north and the kind of continuing persecution of Republicans in the aftermath? Do people leave or do they stay?
Oh, definitely a lot left. There are slightly better lists of women in Tyrone and County Down, and they do give, that they will say, there's a lot of USA against names when they're trying to find out where people went. They've lost contact with them, or people can remember that so and so left and they went. So there are a lot. I mean, obviously, and then quite a few go to Britain, but America is definitely one of the key areas, and IRA activists as well. But she's the only one I've found in terms of Cumann who went and settled there.
Okay, last call for any questions.
Can I just do
Yes,
that?
please.
Thanks very much for this, Margaret. Is it possible that any women could have slipped through the net? Because maybe they weren't. I saw a reference that you mentioned earlier on, women in the IRA, but maybe weren't in the Cumann, because I'm particularly aware of an individual relative of mine who headed up the 50th anniversary parade on the Falls Road, along with all the leaders, and she's not mentioned anywhere. Throughout my history, I have known that she was heavily involved with a friend of Judy Talbot. So I was wondering, is it possible that someone could have slipped through the net that way?
Oh, loads. Yeah, no, I'm sure. I mean, the thing about the military service pension is that Cumann is the organisation that they had to apply as being a member of. They couldn't apply as an IRA. I mean, they were kind of seconded, but they weren't officially members of the IRA, not for purposes of the military service pensions legislation. And there are a lot of women. I'd love to hear more about your relative, but yes, I mean, there were women, particularly if they didn't support the treaty. A lot of them simply just didn't, have any links. I mean, they continued to be active. They obviously didn't want to draw attention to themselves. I mean, people like Cassie O'Hara were definitely important links between the 20s and the later period, and when republicanism starts to remobilize and reorganize.
Look, we've got another question online.
Yeah, we have two now, actually.
Okay.
So firstly, Edward Malloy says, is there a sense that the North and Northern Republican women in particular are a source of embarrassment for the post-1932 establishment, both because of the maintenance of partition and the retrograde status of women in the South, and so encourages silence on their experience?
I don't think the North is an embarrassment to the South. I don't think the South thought about the North. I think it's more an example of how partition really divided the island. I mean, what you get from Northerners when they're applying is so often saying, look, in the South, they just don't understand. We're trying to get references, but we don't know where people have gone. They've crossed the border, they've emigrated. We can't get hold of them. Nobody's helping us and then the other thing is that they're worried that they'll self-incriminate, because you've got the Special Powers Act. Cumann an outlawed organisation in the North. They don't want, so they often wait until somebody's going down across the border before they post anything, because they're anxious that because there's postal censorship, that their letters aren't opened. So you've got that incomprehension on the two sides, and when women say, well, how will I get things back? And the assessor, writes very coldly, well, I don't know, that's up to you. There doesn't seem to be any sympathy from the South for the Northerners and the predicament that they're in. So I just think that there's just a lack of awareness about the North from the South, rather than them being an embarrassment. They really I mean, once Michael Collins dies, I mean, you know, people like Roger Macaulay all say, well, we lost all hope then. And republicanism, certainly for that generation, kind of collapses. It's, you know, the Special Powers Act, mass internment, the agenda, everything else comes down, and so many cross the border. You've got about 20,000 crossing the border. You've got some of them joining the Free State Army, but you've got just the absolute disintegration of republicanism in the north, and people trying to keep their heads down, as they say, and just keep going.
Okay. One more online.
Yeah, so Brendan Sadler says, would Margaret know of any books or papers about the IRA, about the old IRA, Cumann, and the Glens of Antrim?
Just this one.
I don't. Well, I mean, there's Brian Feeney's got a book out on the revolution in County Antrim, so that will, you know, and that is mainly the IRA. He mentions Cumann, but just a few examples from the pension files. But if you're interested in the IRA in County Antrim, Brian Feeney's is the only book I can really think that exists.
Okay, and the last question.
This is a bit of a mind bender now. Sorry. Thanks so much for your talk and for your books, which I've been reading since I was a young scholar 20 years ago. But can I ask you if you can kind of unpack for us a little bit, to what extent is it that the conversation we just had about, you know, how exceptional these women were versus what was going on in the general community? Because the longer I study as a feminist researcher, the more I realise that not all women are feminists and not all women take the same view as me. So is there a sense sometimes, I think, in women's history that we're inclined to look, we have that feminist gaze, we're the ones trying to get women counted in again, and that in a way we count the exceptional women more when we're likely to do that, and there's so few people working in the field anyway, and that we kind of don't necessarily draw in the background, if I'm making sense, and whether that's something that can be done in terms of what the general, so the women at the time versus feminist women, because would you say Cumann was a feminist organisation?
No, I would never say Cumann was a feminist organisation. It becomes quite a radical organisation, say in the 1930s, and it certainly responds after 1916. There are feminists within Cumann, and there's pressure there after 1916 when it talks about equal suffrage, etc. You know, they have a new clause in their constitution about women taking up their proper place in the life of the nation. So it gives them, you know, that's Republican imprimatur in a sense, to say we have the right to, you know, stand for election, you know, to be active, to be military, to be taken seriously by the IRA as well. There's always that constant tension between IRA commanders and senior Cumann women as well, as to how they work together and the chain of commands and all sorts of things. So there's uneasy relationships there, and women are having to find their way through that all the time, which means that quite a lot of women are aware of women's place in society and the difficulties that women have in asserting themselves. But, you know, the organisation itself isn't a feminist organisation, but there are women who certainly want equality for women.
Coming from that 1916 banner.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just before you go, if anybody's interested in knowing more about the military pension, there's a selection of free books here. I'm not quite there, but I'd love to.
So, thank you very much, Marie. So, if you want to follow these stories further, Marie has some free books, but also, of course, Margaret's book, Rebel Women, Cumann in Belfast, the Glens of Antrim, is available in all good bookstores. No Alibis, just around the corner, at an affordable price, which is important. And there may even be some signed copies around. No Alibis. There might be if you go quickly. So, can we finish by thanking Margaret for coming and sharing her thoughts today? And before everyone goes, we have a seminar next Monday. We have Ida Milne from Carlow College and Paul Donnelly coming to talk about the Elms letters, letters of a Protestant Wexford family in the 1798 rebellion and its aftermath. So you're all very welcome to come along to that, 4:30 in this room next Monday. Sorry.